Welcome to the 10-minute coaching video for Sunday, February 7th. We're continuing in our series in Philippians, and this Sunday we are in Philippians 3, verse 17 to chapter 4, verse 1. And this video is meant to be a bit of a resource for you if you're leading a discussion with a family member or your whole family maybe around the table, or with a life group or micro life group or just, a friend. But if you're in a discussion group of some form, following the sermon with the goal of sort of trying to understand the passage of scripture and apply it to our lives, this video is meant to just help you in that process of that discussion time. I will mention too that every week we put together some questions that are posted in the sermon notes, and those are on our website if you're looking to get a hold of those. And those questions will also be a great help in your conversation. So I'll try to kind of do this video without sort of re-preaching the sermon, but basically giving you some cues as to where you might go in a discussion time. And where I would start with this is really talking about the idea of examples and the power of example. If you think about people in your life who've had an influence on you, probably a big part of the influence is the example that they've lived out before you. So it might be fun in your group to talk about, who are some of the people who've had an influence by their example. Who have you learned from through watching their life? And maybe it's a coach on a sports team, or a teacher that you've had, or a pastor, or a friend, or a family member. There's all kinds of people who influence us. So just take some time and talk about who are the people who've influenced you, and how did they influence you, and maybe ask the question, why were they such a significant influence? What made them influential through their example? And you've maybe heard the old adage, there's more caught than taught. Often in parenting we'll talk about that, where kids learn from their parents as much, or if not more, through their example than through their words or their lectures. Maybe talk about that a bit. Is it true? Is more caught than taught? And just this whole idea of examples, I would really dive into that and kind of, let that really start out your conversation. Because in this passage, that's where Paul starts. He says to the Philippians, join together in following my example, brothers and sisters. And so he's moved from, just writing and teaching through verbal instruction to saying, like, look at my life and follow my example. And it might be fun to do a bit of an overview of Philippians and look at Paul's example. How is Paul revealed through the letter to the Philippians? Because he talks quite a bit about himself and his circumstances and his spiritual journey. What kind of example does Paul give through the book of Philippians? That might be the next place to go in your conversation, and just talk about, what do we know about Paul, and what was he like, and what was his journey with Jesus like, and what can we learn from him? He's inviting the believers in Philippi to follow his example, and he goes on, he says, just as you have us as a model, keep your eyes on those who live as we do. So he's making this bigger than just himself. There's others that we can follow in our spiritual journey. So that's, a really great place to dive in your discussion. Another place you might want to go in your discussion time is around this question of, how do we actually know who's following Jesus? Paul in the passage will talk about those who are enemies of the cross, and he goes on to describe them a little bit. Kind of gets me thinking about, in our day and age, are there people who sort of pretend to follow Jesus or claim to follow Jesus, but if we were to really look closely at their lives, maybe they don't. What would be, this is another question maybe to entertain in your group, is what would be an enemy of the cross today? Somebody who's maybe pretending to follow Jesus, but when we look at their lives, we just go, no, I don't think that's really true. And it might be good to compare those examples to what, the example of Paul in Philippians. And then where I will go in the sermon is back to chapter 2, verses 6 to 8 specifically. But 5 to 11 is kind of that whole passage where it's Paul sort of lifting up Jesus as the example, and then we can look at him as the true example of he is the the test, so to speak. If we want to know who's following Jesus, well, who looks like Jesus? And the example that is given is Philippians 2, verses 5 to 11, and specifically 6 to 8. What did Jesus do in verses 6 to 8? Maybe talk about that. And what's the example that he gives us? That might help inform, whether you're an enemy of the cross or a friend of the cross, if you want to call it that. And so that's kind of the ultimate example that we want to follow. And around that idea of, Philippians 2, the example that, Jesus' example that's given there, you might want to go into the Gospels and then just even talk as a group, how did Jesus live out the realities of Philippians chapter 2? It ultimately talks about how he went to the cross. But a lot happened in Jesus' life and ministry before getting to the cross. And it might be worth asking in your group, how did Jesus live the cross life or the way of the cross in his life before he got to the cross? How did he demonstrate love and self-sacrificing love? How did he demonstrate servanthood? When did he teach about servanthood? There's some places you could go. You could talk about that. So, maybe do a bit of an overview of Jesus' life. And what's the example that he's given us? And what can we learn from his example as we try to model our lives after not just Paul and Paul's companions, but ultimately after Jesus himself? There's a couple other images you might want to talk about in this Philippians 3 passage. One is the idea of family, and the other is the idea of citizenship. But this sort of family metaphor shows up. Paul talks to the Philippians and he refers to them as brothers and sisters. On a couple of occasions, he does that. And so it kind of evokes this image of family. And again, when you think about examples, if you think about your family, maybe it's your family you're in right now or your family of origin, think about how you rubbed off on each other, how family members tend to influence each other, and maybe talk about that a little bit. What does it look like for family members to be examples to one another, and how have you experienced that in your life? And then how is that metaphor applicable to our journey with Jesus? The last point that I'll make in the sermon is let's follow Jesus together, because our journey with Jesus is not meant to be an individual journey. It's meant to be a shared journey. It's a communal journey. And we can learn from each other and rub off on each other, just like family members. Brothers and sisters will influence each other. Parents towards children will influence each other. Even extended family members might have an influence on us. And so it's that family metaphor in the family of God. Why is it important that we journey with Jesus together? Why is it important that we strive to follow Jesus together? And maybe talk about that family image. And then the last one is this idea of citizenship, which kind of speaks to our identity, and it gets back to this idea of, are you a friend of the cross or an enemy of the cross? Paul's writing to the Philippians and he says, our citizenship is in heaven. You have a different identity, you have a different way of life, you have a different leader than those who have their minds set on earthly things, which he says in verse 19. The enemies of the cross have their minds set on earthly things. And then he says, but our citizenship is in heaven. So what does it mean to live as a citizen of heaven in the world today? What does it mean to embrace the way of the cross in the world today? What does it mean to follow Jesus together in a world that's maybe not all following Jesus? Those are some different places that you could go. And his final exhortation, chapter 4, verse 1, therefore, my brothers and sisters, you whom I love and long for, my joy and crown, stand firm in the Lord in this way, dear friends. I think Paul is encouraging us to learn from one another, to learn from him, to learn from his companions, ultimately to follow Jesus' example, to live that out and to share it with one another, to stand firm in the Lord together, to follow Jesus together. And so a final question and place to go in your conversation might be just to talk about, who are the people in your life who are currently influencing you to follow Jesus? Who are the examples that you're allowing to rub off on you? And then who are you rubbing off on? Who are you being an example to? Who are you leading and encouraging in their journey of following Jesus? So blessings on you as you discuss this passage. Hopefully there's lots more that comes to you as you read it and discuss it together, and ultimately seek to follow Jesus together. So have a great discussion. Talk to you later.